you guys watch Friends?
Yeah.
Alright, this wasn't funny, apparently. Well, really excited to be kicking off this new series, Sex, Money, Power, because they're really difficult topics, and I feel like I thrive just talking about really difficult things. No, honestly, I did a survey a while back. I sent out a questionnaire to about 20 different college-age people. And I asked them, what do you want us to be talking about in the church? And like 3/4 of them were like, controversial topics. So I was like, okay, let's find the difficult questions. Let's lean into them. This is going to be week 1 in Sex, Money, Power. We're going to be focusing on sexuality. This week we're going to be talking about purity culture. If you don't know what that is, we'll dig into it. Next week we're going to be talking about being gay and the kingdom of God. What does that mean? Week after that, we're going to talk about transgender sexuality and the faith. So if you or anyone that you know is in the middle of any of those experiences, I recommend that you invite them, because we're going to be handling this conversation with a lot of grace and a lot of patience and a lot of mercy and zero condemnation and judgment. So that's a promise for me, and if that doesn't happen, well, it will happen. So tonight, before I introduce our guest speaker, I want to do one thing. I want to say on behalf of the church, I'm sorry. We're sorry. If you have been made to feel ashamed of your body, if you have been made to feel like you are gross or beyond redemption because of your sexual behavior, if you've been made to feel like you are a disgrace or an embarrassment because of your desires, if you've been told that your value has been diminished because of your sexual sin, I want to say, on behalf of the church, we are sorry. We've seen the church endeavor to try to handle the conversation of sexuality. Sometimes God works with the broken nature of church and blesses people. Other times people get in the way of God, and they do hurtful things, and they say hurtful things, and they damage people. So we're sorry, and I ask for your forgiveness on behalf of the body of Christ that is not perfect as Christ is. Would you forgive us? So tonight we're going to examine what the church has tried to do and perhaps redeem and nuance what Jesus is trying to do in and through us when it comes to our sexuality and our faith, when it comes to sexual ethics or sexual morality. And to help me do that, as I was putting together guest speakers for this series, I thought, who can we invite in to do this? And Ashleigh Rich was one of the first people that popped onto that list.
It's always good when you're the first person that comes to mind when we're talking about sex.
Absolutely.
Actually, we're
talking your mic again?
Yes, I can do that.
You know what? Oops, we're gonna do it.
Oh, that's not terrible. Fireworks.
Don't worry, it's just right. Try that? Of course not. You know why? Because that mic needs fan power.
I don't think it does.
Really? We'll try this one.
They just really didn't want you to be able to hear me.
Sorry about that. But yeah, we wanted to bring Ashleigh in. Ashleigh is brilliant and wonderful and articulate and all of the things. And so I'm just going to give you a little bit about why I've invited her in. She, has a master's in divinity, which means she studied really, really hard the scriptures for a very long time.
Most pretentious degree title of all time.
She also has a bachelor's in Bible and theology from Wheaton College. And while she was studying the scriptures and God very intently, she often focused on topics of sexuality. And she is on staff here on our adult ministries team, and she has a blog that she has a lot of blogs on, from what I understand.
I kept it up for 2.5 years, and recently haven't written as much, but it's all still there. So if you want to dig into more of this, feel free. It's just myname.com, not my name, but AshleighRich.com.
my name, fill-in-the-blank.com.
Someone should take that URL if they haven't already.
Yeah, I mean, she's written about, about dating, about singleness, about marriage, about
All the fun
the things, yeah. And so I thought this would be a great voice to invite into what we're going to talk about tonight. So Ashleigh, clearly from looking at your body of work and the things that you like to write about and talk about, you're clearly passionate about this subject of sexuality. Why are you so passionate about the conversation of faith and sexuality? What has drawn you to it?
It's probably two things that have kind of drawn interest. One was just kind of a happenstance of the very first non-Christian or non-fiction Christian book that I read was when I was 11. I was in a Bible study and they were like, we're going to read I Kissed Dating Goodbye by Joshua Harris. And I'm an Enneagram 1, so having all of this, this is how you do things right, I was like, yes, this is really interesting. But more than that, that was the first book that I ever read where it was like, oh my gosh, this is somebody who's taking all these stories from the Bible that I've learned since I was a little kid and all these memory verses that I have stuck in my head and have actually applied them to real life. And so I just thought that was really awesome. So even though there's people hating on Joshua Harris, he always has a special place in my heart because he just opened my eyes to that of oh wow, this is how we can apply the Bible to stuff today. So that was kind of just random of that was the first book I read, and then it was oh, there's more, so I just kept reading and going down this black hole of dating and relationship book. The second thing is that it's something that I struggled with of being in high school and then in college and wanting to have a relationship and not having one, and so since those who don't have read, so I just kept reading more about well, if I'm not married and I'm not having sex and I don't have a relationship, I'll just keep reading about it so that by the time I get there, I'll know what I'm doing. So that's kind of how that went, and I just found it really interesting. So even after, and it one thing led to another. It's one of those bad Wikipedia holes that you go through where you start reading one article and that leads to another one, and then all of a sudden you know everything there is to know about Jonestown or something really morbid. Except I decided to do that with sexuality and dating and relationships and singleness and all that stuff. So I just kept reading. I still am. So it's great.
Wow, fascinating.
Yes.
Okay, so you grew up in church then?
Yes. So when I was born, I interrupted my father's Greek exam. He was in Bible college. He was studying to be a pastor and was a youth pastor at the time. So I've literally been in church my whole life, and unless you were dying, you were there in my family. So that also kind of fed into my interest in the topic. Was growing up in church, no one ever said this explicitly, but implicitly I kind of pulled in this message of if you do all the right things, if you are a good girl, and I'm very good at being a good girl, P.S., then you will get all of the good things in life. And so that was kind of what I thought, and I'm great, I'm good at following rules, I can do this. And I did, and then I found myself at 20, graduated from college, not where I wanted to be, no ring by spring, if you're Bible college person, you know what that is. Didn't have a ring by spring, didn't have a date by spring, didn't have anything by spring. And so it was bad, and I just got really upset, God, I have been very good, and you have not upheld your end of the bargain. And that kind of led to this wrestling with God for a couple of years, and I kind of was rebellious, but I'm the lamest rebel of all time, so I have no good stories from that period of my life. But at the end of it, when I was at my worst, that was when God gave me what I wanted, which was a relationship. And it was through that process that I started to really learn what grace meant, because I had always just thought, grace meant we get to go to heaven. That's cool, I guess, but doesn't really do anything for me now. And so having that experience of getting what I knew I least deserved when I least deserved it, but what I really wanted, was just a very clear picture of grace. And so bringing in the grace stuff with all the relationship stuff that I have been reading, that's kind of been my passion for the last 10-ish years, of putting those things together and seeing how if we talk about the behavior only and what we want to do and what God tells us to do, but we don't talk about grace and we don't talk about the heart behind all of that, then we end up with a really skewed view of thinking, which was where I was at 20 years old, being mad at God because I didn't have a ring by spring.
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of people can relate to that for sure. So growing up in the church, seeing how it operated, having your dad, be really into Greek theology and language and stuff. How did you observe the conversation of sexuality being handled in the church?
Well, in my own life, my parents were real bad at it. Bless them. I was homeschooled, so that probably explains a lot too. But like, I remember my mom sat me down and we read this terrible book called Almost 12, and I didn't understand half of it. It made me
Sounds
afraid of
ominous.
boys because it talked about what happened to them, and I was like, ew, that is gross. And then it talked about like heavy petting, and I still don't know what that is. So
That term is the weirdest term.
so gross.
Yeah.
I think it's just like very aggressive
Heavy
touching,
petting.
but I'm really not sure. So
I still don't know to this day.
I'm like,
There's
I've
so
heard
much
it
in
used,
there.
but like the picture that I have with that term is just so bad. So that was about the extent.
This reminds me of like Lenny and the Rabbit, just like
It's
heavy
bad.
petting.
It's bad. Yeah, like you, or like, was it Elmira in Tiny Toon Adventures? Like, I love it and kiss it and squeeze it all up. Like, that's what I think of. But yeah, so there wasn't really, I think maybe my mom thought because I was doing so much extracurricular reading on dating that I was good to go on that. But most of my sexual education came from my friends in high school, which wasn't great. Or if we did talk about stuff in high school, we split up and the girls talked about purity and the boys talked about porn. And that wasn't super helpful either. So yeah, I did a lot of extracurricular reading. So probably the most helpful book that I read was Every Young Woman's Battle by Shannon Eldridge or somebody. And that one actually had like practical, I learned things from it and it was helpful. But for the most part, I was just kind of piecemealing things together. And I think that's been one of the disadvantages of the church is we haven't really had a good plan for how to talk to young people about sexuality, and then we let the world and their high school friends, who, let's be honest, don't know anything, together combine what our view of sexuality is, and then we get really skewed views, and we pick up weird implicit images or like messages from what people are saying or what people are not saying, and it just gets really confusing. So hence my confusion at 20 years old when I was mad that why am I not married yet, which is actually a ridiculous question thinking about it now. But yeah, there wasn't a very good system, and
Yeah.
I think that's been part of why I've been so interested in it too, is how do we do this better? Because I was like your model church youth group citizen, and I feel like I got failed. So what did that mean for the people that weren't there every Sunday and
Yeah.
didn't have parents that were as involved as mine were?
Yeah, I mean, whether or not you bring Christian values into the conversation, some could say that there are other philosophies or worldviews out there that do a better job at least talking about sex at
Yes.
all.
Yeah.
I remember my mom gave my dad the task of like giving me the talk, which is already a problem, right? Like, okay,
Only one's not gonna do it.
so sexuality, whether or not you have it, whether or not you have sex, sexuality is a big part of your life. So we're going to take this really big facet of who you are, and we're going to have one talk about it, okay? And then you're going to be good. I remember my dad, we got into the car to go to school one day, and I lived 7 minutes from my school, and he said, Lane, I need to have a talk with you about where babies come from. And I remember thinking, I'm already ahead of you, Dad, but this is going to be fun. Go ahead. What do you think? And it was one of the most detached, unhelpful conversations ever. So yeah, not even being able to have an open dialogue. You know, sex kind of feels like this. It's like this dirty thing, and so we are afraid, even as parents, our parents, like we're afraid to have conversations about it because we thought if we say the word sex, like they're gonna lose their virginity or whatever. It's like don't talk about cancer, you'll get it. Like that kind of thing. That's what it felt like.
Don't make a will, you'll die.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, so in that way, it actually ended up working against us, I think, where we weren't equipped to understand our sexual desires and what they were a reflection of, and so we tried to understand it in other ways that weren't so helpful.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so for those of us that didn't grow up in church, can you help us define, because I said the word purity culture, we talked about sexual purity. What is the purity movement? What is purity culture? What does purity mean? What is that?
Yeah, so it's interesting if you look at, I think it's interesting just why this is important, because like who cares about this thing that apparently is not around anymore? Generally what happens if you look at church history in general, is that people swing one way and then they overreact and they swing the opposite way. And we can see that a little bit at work today, and that's kind of how the purity movement even came about. So if we look at like the 1950s, everybody's pretty on the same page as like what sexual ethics are. Like everyone agrees if you're gonna have sex, you probably should be married. Not everyone does, but we all agree that's the optimal homosexuality generally seen as bad, living together generally seen as bad, porn generally seen as bad, all these things.
Unless you're a character in Mad Men.
Yes, then yeah, different. Again, people didn't always live out those values, but if you were to poll Americans, and people did, and you look at the poll results, everybody answered pretty similarly whether they considered themselves super religious or not.
They're all hypocrites in the same way.
Yes.
Right.
Then we got to the 60s and the 70s, and it was crazy. There were drugs, that helped. But all of a sudden, like, now, like, living together seen as okay, we've got Woodstock, we've got hippies, we've got this, like, you know, all of the people from the 50s are, like, freaking out, and like, what is happening with these crazy young people? And that was happening in culture in general, but it was specifically happening in the church. And so in the 80s, 90s-ish, the church starts looking at what's happening in the world, and they're genuinely afraid for good reason of how are we going to equip young people when the mores and the like sexual ethics are so different than what they've been, because we want to uphold what God has said in the Bible, but this is a completely different world than what we grew up in, so how are we going to help equip young people? And so their idea was, let's kind of like take the script that the world has written, which is sex is the best thing in the world, it's amazing, it'll blow your mind, it's the most important part of who you are. Let's kind of buy into that and say, yeah, that's really true, but you know what? That's really only true if you get married. And then, like, as soon as you get married, you're going to be able to have sex, and it's going to be awesome, but you just need to wait until you get married. So if you can just cross your legs until you get married, then you will be okay, and then you can just go crazy. And so that was kind of the strategy. So we had True Love Waits was an organization.
I was in True Love Waits as a kid.
Yeah, and so they would have abstinence pledges, and they would go into schools and churches and those kinds of things, and they would have kids sign pledges saying that we're gonna remain virgins until we get married. You had things like, you didn't have to do that. They did have purity rings. I kind of wanted one. I never actually had one, which was basically like your dad would buy you a really fancy ring if you were a girl, and you would go out to eat. I didn't even know boys did this.
Yeah, I have.
Oh, wow. Ooh, I'm kind of jealous. I wanted one. I had a mood ring.
Some people thought I was engaged when I was like 16. So confusing.
Very confusing. But yeah, you were supposed to have this ring that you wore until you got replaced by your wedding ring, and then
Because I was
you would
married
be
to
able
Jesus.
Yeah, that was
That was
also
the
a
phrase
weird
they used,
thing.
like, you're married to Jesus until you're married to someone else. And I remember thinking, I don't know how I feel
I
about
don't
that.
think that's right.
I think we
There's
as
a
a
lot of
church are married to
things
Jesus.
wrong with
I don't
that.
know if me personally am married
Yeah.
to Jesus.
Yes. So the emphasis of the movement was to try to keep young people as pure as possible. The problem was that purity got defined basically as virginity. So you were pure if you were still a virgin. Now, as Bill Clinton can tell us, you can do a lot of things without having real sex. And that was part of the problem with the purity movement, is that what it did was it drew a line for people that said you can go up to this line and you are still pure. And so you had weird things going on where Christians are like, yeah, I've signed this abstinence pledge, but I'm giving my boyfriend a blowjob every night. Like, that's not what purity really
Actually,
is.
we're in church. You can't say that.
I just you can tell Brad, I don't think he'll care. Yeah, so it was just like this weird, it kind of became a legalistic thing of like, as long as we don't have sex, we're good. But there was like another side of it too, with like the Joshua Harris, like I Kiss Dating Goodbye. P.S. When I read the book, I hadn't even said hello to dating, so that was kind of weird. But in his book, and there were a couple other people at the time that were like, oh my gosh, so basically they're like, dating leads to sex. So like, we just shouldn't have dating. We should like go back to like the 1800s, and a young woman will ask her gentleman caller to come to the parlor and meet with the family. Yeah, and so there was like all this whole other thing that was like, okay, let's also reject worldly patterns of dating, and that will help, supposedly. And then there gets to be more lines drawn. So Joshua Harris has this thing where he's like, there's this couple and they didn't kiss until they got married, and that's super awesome. And so then you have all these girls that are like, oh, I was like, that sounds really romantic, but I don't want my first kiss to be in front of my mom. So I really struggled with that one. I had like mental dialogue with myself of like, do we kiss when we get engaged? Do we kiss when like it's kind of serious? I don't want to do it in front of my
Kiss during the
mom.
first look, and then
Yeah, I don't know.
yeah, like when they take the first picture.
Just so you know, I did not kiss my husband for the first time we got married. That happened way before then. But yeah. So
Yeah.
there was all kinds of legalism, and you've got this kind of what Lane was talking about earlier of people seeing their bodies as gross because all of a sudden we're trying to repress this sexual desire that we have. So there's not a good place. God created the desire, but now we're just fighting against it. We're not saying it has a good purpose and it can be rechanneled. We're just saying we gotta fight against it.
Sex is bad, sex is bad, sex is bad.
Yeah.
Wedding day, sex is good.
Yeah,
You're just
and
whoa. What?
And if you go home tonight and you're really bored and you're like, hey, I want to learn more about this, and you Google purity movement, purity culture, Joshua Harris, any of that, you will find dozens of articles written by people who will talk about how, I bought into this whole thing, and then I got married, and then me and my husband couldn't have sex because I thought that sex was bad for so long that I couldn't enjoy it, and I still can't, and we've been married for 10 years, sad stories of just kind of how that played out. So the overall purpose of the movement was good. They had a really good objective, and that was we want to help young people in the midst of this crazy sexual craze. What ended up happening, though, wasn't so good. And there were good pieces of it, and there were way bad pieces of it. Very much a mixed bag. But we don't want to hate on the poor people. But at the same time, be able to look at it and say, this part was good, that part was bad. And there was a lot of both, actually.
Yeah, and I think obviously the problem was using shame as a tool, maybe inadvertently.
Mm-hmm.
I think the stuff that came out of the movement often made people feel ashamed of their sexuality, of their bodies. And
Yeah, even for things that maybe weren't their fault. I remember I read an article by Elizabeth Smart, who had been abducted from her home and was missing for 2 years or something, and some guy kidnapped her and said, "You're my new wife," and she was 14 or something, and so he raped her repeatedly, and she was actually Mormon, and so when she was returned to her family, she was back in Mormon Sunday school or something, I don't know, and they were doing a lesson that was every time you're a glass of water and every time you have sex with someone, there's a little more dirt in that glass of water. And she was writing in the article, she was I was heartbroken because I was do they know that I am in this room and what they are saying about me and something that happened that I did not want to happen to me, and now I'm a dirty glass of water against my will.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling actually when I think about illustrations like that. I got one a little different. I got the flower illustration, which is mostly applied to girls, which is totally sexist.
Well, it's
by the way.
flowers, so.
But they would use that illustration to apply to everyone, but they'd be talking to the girls in the room.
Yes.
But they'd say you're a flower. Every time you have sex with somebody, you give a petal away, and if you keep doing that, you're gonna have nothing left.
Then
to
you
give
have a
your husband.
stan.
Yeah, you're not beautiful anymore. And I remember even as a 13-year-old kid going that doesn't sound like the gospel to me.
No.
That doesn't sound like full redemption and human flourishing in the name of Jesus and the grace and his sacrifice. That sounds like condemnation and what the Pharisees were trying to do. So I was like, where is it that we can say your sin makes you less valuable to your future partner? Where is the gospel? Where is grace in that?
Yeah.
I found that really problematic.
And I think looking back on my own life, that was the thing that was most problematic for me, is the fact that your effort is tied to your outcome. That if you are a good girl, if you are a good boy, and you keep your legs crossed, and whatever, you don't kiss anyone, then God is really happy with you. But if you go out there and you have a crazy night and you have a one-night stand, you are now ruined forever, and your husband's going to look at you as a dirty glass of water, which is not true, and also then makes sin far more powerful than it actually is.
It also oversimplifies it so much
Yes.
because the act of having sex can be so complex depending on a person's preferences, background, chemistry. There is no one size fits all in terms of how it's going to work. There can be people that didn't even look at the opposite sex till they get married, and then they do, and sex is awkward for a year before they start enjoying it. It's you can't boil it down to one expression or one experience.
Yeah, and I think that's true on the relationship side of that too, was there were so many examples of this is what a Christian relationship should look like. He asks her dad to court you, and then you do that for a year, and and it's just this really weird, and it's just discounting the millions of ways that two people can end up together in a relationship that's really healthy. Because in my own case, what happened was me and my husband had the most unhealthy, terrible texting relationship for a year. And then we did not talk for a year because I dated someone else because he told me to. And then we broke up. And then I ended up married to the first guy that had that really terrible, and if according to what I had been reading in all of those books, that should have been a really awful relationship and we shouldn't have gotten married.
Yeah.
But the reality of it was that there was redemption for both of us, who were both PS in a terrible place in our life at the time. And God used that situation, and it ended up being a good thing. It really discounts the power of redemption and the power of grace when you boil everything down to a one-size-fits-all solution, or say that your sin forever defines you.
And yeah, say that again. That is, I mean, don't literally say
I
it
was
again,
gonna
but
say, I don't even remember what I said
that
now.
was like my meme brain, like, say it again, put the people in the back. Yeah, for sure.
It's free for Twitter if you can remember it.
Okay, so just to cap that off, if you've been told that because if you've had a sexual experience or you've seen pornography or whatever, that you're somehow less valuable to your future spouse or something like that, I just want to say absolutely untrue, 100% untrue. The redemptive power of Jesus makes you as valuable as you will ever be, no matter what. And your partner that will, or maybe you'll be single for your whole life. We can talk about that later too. But whatever you end up doing with your sexuality, Jesus, his grace is present in it and can make anything beautiful. And I mean anything.
If he can turn Rahab the prostitute into somebody who ends up in his genealogy, he can redeem anybody.
That's good. Okay, so deconstructing the shame mentality. So, not trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? You said the purity movement was going to try to accomplish something good, but it did it in ways that ended up working against what it was trying to accomplish.
Yes.
And creating shame and a lot of other problems. What does biblical sexuality actually look like then? And is there inherently something that is shameful in sex? What are the rules?
Oh, that's so interesting. And what's interesting about that is that people have been arguing about that for a really long time. If you look at like church history, there were church fathers who said we cannot find any redeeming value in sex, and basically you should only use it to make babies. That is not a biblical view of sexuality, because apparently they never read the book of Song of Songs. That's, pomegranates, and I'm gonna climb up your palm
grapes.
tree and grab your coconuts.
That's not how it goes. Is that how that goes?
Something like that. Yeah. Yeah, it's like I'm gonna climb. You're a tree. I'm gonna climb you and grab your fruit. Like, pretty sure we all know what that's saying.
Yeah. That's not about babies.
Nope,
No.
not about babies.
No.
But I think if we look at what the Bible has to say about sexuality, we can often look at it and think, wow, there's a lot of rules in here. And there are. The Bible does give, especially if you're in the Old Testament, because there's all kinds of rules about who you should and should not marry, like don't marry a woman and her sister. That's a good rule. You should follow it. And so, it's great.
Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah. I don't actually suggest you marry two people. It never ends up very well for anyone in the Bible, but there are rules about it. There are a lot of rules there, but I think we tend to think of that of like, oh my gosh, the Bible is so repressive. Look at all these things that we can't do. What we forget is if we believe the Bible is true, then we know that God created us to be male and female in his image. His first commandment was that we be fruitful and multiply, and P.S. that includes babies, and to make babies you have to have sex. And so God likes sex. He invented sex. He, made it so that it is a pleasurable thing, because he could have just made it like, hey, to make a baby, we just like touch each other's fingers. Whoop, there it is. But he didn't do that. He made it a lot more exciting and a lot more fun.
Yeah.
And so he is a fan.
It's like having pleasure when you eat food. Like,
Yeah, he
food
could have made all food taste like saltines. That would have been really boring.
But we have, like AJ said, we have mangoes.
Yes.
Right? We have things that taste really good, and
We have
that's
Cheetos.
a gift. That's an expression of God's delight in us,
Yeah.
is our ability to experience
God
pleasure.
likes fun and God likes joy. He invented
Yeah.
those too. And so if we look at the Bible instead of as, oh my gosh, look at all these rules, we look at the Bible more in some ways as like a user manual of God is giving, I created this thing to work in this way. And God even gives us, like, you like look at a lawnmower and it says like, do not use on roof. And you're like, oh, there's a story behind that. Someone used this on a roof and I want to know what happened. The Bible gives us some of those stories of like, hey, like Jacob, he marries Rachel and Leah, and that doesn't turn out very well. And that's why you don't marry a woman and her sister. So there's a lot of examples there of like, this is what it looks like to do this well, and this is what happens when you don't do this well, and these are the consequences even. So looking at the Bible that way, we can see that if we follow the biblical commands about sexuality, what we're actually doing is we're having the good life that God intended, the sexual good life that He intended. We're not limiting ourselves or being repressive or even trying to be judgmental towards people, because isn't that different of saying, like, if someone's, using a toaster as a hammer and you're like, hey, that's actually not how you use that appliance, that's not judging the person, you're trying to help them of like, hey, like, if you actually want to use this toaster to the best of its ability, you'll plug it in and put bread in it, and you won't try to hammer a nail into the wall with it. And the Bible is like that. It's, here is how this thing should be used if you want to use it to the best of its ability. That doesn't mean that if you use it for only part of its ability, that you won't get some of the good benefits of it either. So when people have sex outside of marriage, it can be a really powerful experience. It can be really bonding, it can be really exciting, you can get that pleasure. You're still getting part of it when you use it, not quite how it's 100% supposed to be used. But if you want to get 100% of the benefits, here's the manual that shows you how to do that.
Yeah, and I think, we get the pendulum swing reaction, right? So you have the purity culture that's super oppressive, really wants to control what you feel, how you feel it, when you feel it. And then you have people that, 85% of people who grow up in the church walk away by the time they're 25. So they walk away from the faith, and then we lean into this, like, sexual liberation, right? Like, my pleasure is paramount. What I want, how I want it, that is what I'm chasing in life, and you don't have any right to tell me whether or not I can't have it the way that I want it. And that's the other end of the spectrum, that obviously, there are reasons why there are guidelines around how and why to do something, because it's for our own good. And I think something that I've observed is that our popular culture tends to put our personal pleasure, but especially our sexual pleasure, on this really high paramount of a mountain of a goal. If you can just find true love, we could be homeless, we could be broke, but as long as I'm having really good sex with you for the rest of my life. Yeah, and I think that even of itself can be problematic, because the Bible tells this narrative of self-sacrifice, deny themselves, and that's where we find freedom, that's where we find fulfillment. We talk about Paul pouring out his life like a drink offering. That life isn't about self-fulfillment. And so I think we see this clashing of people in our culture who have not been talked about, sex has not been talked about in their homes, of the faith that they grew up in, when the Bible has a lot to say about it that is not just about don't do it. There's things to say about it. And then the culture is providing so many other parallel narratives about sexuality that the voice of our faith gets drowned out because it has nothing to say in response.
Yeah, we haven't been very good at sharing that message of, this is what the world is saying about sex, this is what God has said about it, and this is why we're telling you not to do it. Because if you have a why for something, you're a lot more likely to do it than if somebody just gives you a rule. And I think, the overemphasis on pleasure makes sex basically a very selfish pursuit. And you look at Ephesians 5, of Paul describes marriage as a picture of God and the church, or Christ and the church. And in that case, Christ gives up his life for his bride. And that's the very opposite of that. It's not, I want you because you make me feel good. It's, I'm willing to die for you because I value you over myself, which is the very opposite of the message that we often get.
At this point, I just want to remind you that number that you texted to do attendance. Chris, can you just throw it up there again, just in case? If you have questions that you want to throw up to me and Ashleigh, it will be anonymous. Throw them up, and I'll read them to Ashleigh.
The more awkward, the better, so please.
Yeah, I mean, lay it out there. Obviously, we said the word blowjob a few minutes ago, so there's not much that's off limits in terms of what you want to ask. Please do. I don't know if you guys, just to take a quick sideliner, but for 3 years I spent, I was in public schools, about 25 different public schools, talking about sex for a living.
He's an expert.
No, I'm not a sexpert or anything, but it was interesting because I got really used to talking about anatomy and sexuality, and I would forget that the rest of life isn't necessarily like a health classroom. So I would say the word orgasm really loud in a room, and I would turn heads, and I'm like, oh wait, this is not a health classroom. That's right, we should probably dial it back. Okay, so now that we're talking about sex outside of marriage, probably a lot of us are thinking, what's What's the big deal? Like, if I want to live with my boyfriend or girlfriend and have sex with them before I decide whether or not I want to spend the rest of my life with them, it's a big decision. I want to know, something like the terminology used to be like test drive the car before you buy it, that kind of mentality.
Why buy the cow if the milk's cheaper?
Right, yeah, or that one.
I think that's an insulting,
Yeah,
idiom.
that has a few problems. Carrying moving to cattle is always usually a problem, I've found.
Yeah,
but-
not a good move.
But what's the big deal? Why can't I live with a person and have sex with them before I get married? Why?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the problem is that, like I said, sometimes when you use sex not to its 100% of how it's supposed to be, you still get a lot of the benefits. And so you can see people who are like, well, they had sex before they got married, and then they're like, fine. And so we can kind of play a comparative game there and be like, well, it was okay for them, so surely it's okay for me. But the problem is that part of it is one of the reasons that God puts sex within marriage is because of the commitment piece. And when you are married, you are saying, when you're up at the altar, I am promising that I am going to unconditionally love you. And that creates some safety for you. It's very different saying, we are going to have sex, or we are going to live together, and as soon as I am no longer happy with you, or you are no longer happy with me, we are going to go our separate ways. That's not how sex was designed to work. There's a wonderful book called Hooked, and I cannot remember who wrote it, but it is written by two neurosurgeons or doctors or some kind of experts in that field. And the entire book is about the neuroscience behind sex, and when you have sex, what happens in your brain. And both for men and women, it looks a little differently in men and women, there's different chemicals involved, but when you have sex, you have bonding chemicals that are released into your brain, and those are designed to bind you to the person that you are having sex with. What happens if you have serial sexual partners, or even if you have just more than one, your brain, it takes more of those chemicals to have the same kind of bonding experience. And if you continue to have multiple sexual partners, eventually the bonding element kind of goes away, and you have to work to build it back. So even the way, again, God designed our bodies, He designed our brains, He designed the genitals, He designed everything to work in harmony so that sex is supposed to be this emotionally, physical, spiritually binding experience. And when we take that outside of how it was meant to be, oftentimes somebody gets hurt in that situation. And whether that's an emotional hurt or a physical hurt or a spiritual hurt, we're not using it the way it's supposed to be used, and there are going to be consequences. It doesn't mean you're going to die. I remember watching the show, I think it's Freaks and Geeks, where the dad's like, do you know what happened to this person? They had sex and now they're dead. That's not how it looks. It doesn't mean that your life is over. It doesn't mean that maybe.
One doesn't necessarily lead to
that did happen in Downton Abbey. The girl had sex with the boy and he died in the middle of it. It's weird. It's like season 2 or something. Anyway, so it could happen, but that's very unusual. But yeah, most of the time it's not going to look that dire, but there are going to be consequences. And some of that can be seen in the same book, and there's another one called Premarital Sex in America, where they looked at a bunch of surveys with college students and young adults, and they found that people who had multiple sexual partners, and it's actually worse for some reason in women, they have a higher likelihood of depression, mental health problems, anxiety, that kind of thing. So the authors of the book Hooked, they said their premise was, we want people to know that the biggest dangers of premarital sex are not STDs and pregnancy. The biggest dangers are actually mental health problems. And they were positing that a lot of mental health issues were caused because of how many young adults and teenagers are sexually active. So,
and the same principles actually apply to watching pornography too. So
yes.
Your brain can become accustomed to having orgasms while looking at pornographic imagery.
Mm-hmm.
So your brain associates pornography with that action,
yeah.
With that feeling, and so it tends to harm your physical sexual relationships because it's wanting the other thing. So analogy that I used to use is that sexual activity can work a lot like duct tape, which I think is a lot more helpful than the flour or dirty glass of water conversation, which is duct tape, you stick it on and it's meant to hold there, and sexual chemicals are like a relational glue that you keep every time you have sex, every time you experience orgasms together. It's like pouring on more of that glue. It's like adding more of that duct tape, and it makes that feeling of connection really strong. But if you do that and you rip off that piece of duct tape and take it to another surface, and another surface, another surface, another surface, eventually it begins to lose its stick. And our brains get confused in the same way, and it begins to lose the association. If you think about it, even just logically, a person who's had sex with 50 people versus a person who's had sex with one person, the act of sex is going to have more weight for one of those people.
Yeah.
But again, here's the beautiful thing. It's not like a flower that's losing its petals, because your brain is amazing in the way that it's designed, and it can heal. Like any addiction, like any kind of dependency to drugs or alcohol or anything, there is a way for your brain to bounce back from the damage that we do to it, which is another testament to like God's redemption and His forgiveness. And so I would say, if you hear that, you're like, oh my gosh, like I've had so many sexual partners, or I've seen so many pornographic images. You are not trapped to what has been done and what you've gotten used to. There are pathways forward, and it's difficult and hard, and it will not be fast or easy, but it can happen. There can be healing in those things. All right, well, let's ask one more question,
Okay.
and then we'll get into some of the questions that people are asking,
Sounds good.
because we have a few that have come in.
Ooh, good questions.
Masturbation.
Huh?
What's the big deal? Why does the church freak out about masturbation?
I don't know why the church freaks out about it so much. It's kind of weird. It's not something you hear about. I think actually part of the reason that people are nervous about masturbation, at least in the modern era specifically, is that it's often linked with pornography. And like Lane was saying, that can be addictive. Masturbation itself can be addictive, and that obviously can be dangerous. At the same time, the Bible doesn't say anything about masturbation. There's like one story that people try to say like, this is about it. It's not. If you hear anybody referencing Onan, be like, no, that's not what that story is about. So God doesn't say anything about that. P.S. God designed our bodies so that we can reach down there. So I don't know what that means. Take that for what it's worth. And He doesn't say anything about it specifically. So I'm not endorsing it. Don't go out and be like, Ashleigh said I should. No.
Ashleigh said.
But actually, I think one of the best people that I've read on that particular topic is Lauren Winner. She has a book that is excellent. That's called Real Sex. And hers is actually one of my favorite books. And she has a chapter or a section or something about masturbation. She says, like, Christians need to calm down about it, basically. She's like, I get why they're kind of nervous about it. But at the same time, she's like, it's not, as long as it's not addictive, as long as it's not overpowering you, it's probably not that big of a deal. And I kind of tend to think of it like I would think of like alcohol or marijuana or something. It's permissible. The Bible doesn't say, Jesus drank wine if we're talking about alcohol. But it is something that can master you. And as long as you can stand before God and say, hey, I'm doing this thing, how do you feel about this? And as long as you're not feeling guilt or shame about it, then it's probably okay. Because I've heard and I've read, there's another book that is really good called Soul Virgins, and they talk about this a little bit as well, that for some people, they can use masturbation to curb sexual desire like every once in a while, and it just makes life easier for them. And if that's the case for you, awesome, go for it. Probably don't tell anyone just because it's kind of weird, like not a subject for polite conversation usually. But like that's between you and God. And so if that's a tool that you feel like God is fine with you using, then great. The problem gets to be when you pair it with pornography, or fantasy or anything like that. If there's other sins that are accompanying that, then that's something that you probably need to talk to Jesus about. But yeah, I tend to feel like alcohol or weed or whatever, where it's like, the Bible doesn't say anything about it. It's probably to some extent acceptable, but there's also going to be a point at which it could become sinful for you if it becomes like an obsession or an addiction or something that you're just feeling a lot of guilt about.
Yeah, and just to be encouraged, this is when we were preparing for this conversation, Ashleigh and I had a little bit of tension surrounding this topic. And so know that it's okay to have slightly varying opinions about these things too. I think part of it might stem from the fact that I'm a male and she's a female, and those two sexes experience masturbation differently sometimes. I just, from my perspective, obviously lusting can be problematic, right? So Jesus is like, you said to yourself, don't commit adultery, but I'm telling you, you look at a person with lust, you've committed adultery in your heart. And in my mind, I'm like, masturbation without lust, I don't know if I can accomplish that.
And to
Not
that
I've
I
been trying to
said,
accomplish
"You're
that.
not a girl."
Right. And so we talked briefly about like anatomical differences and whatnot. We uncomfortable yet? This is good. And so yeah. And again, if we look at the broader, easy over there.
Too much. Yeah, I think your wife is laughing the hardest at that. I don't know what that means.
Dude, she's such a trouble. I deliberately did not put her in my group during the conference because I knew. I was like, I'm gonna put her in a different group because they're gonna be crazy and it's gonna be fine. Okay. If we look at the broader narrative of sexuality in the scriptures, it's meant to be this relational experience. And so when I look at masturbation, I see that as a singular experience, and I have a hard time reconciling those narratives. But again, I don't think it's super black and white in the scriptures. So I think that there's room for this kind of tension, and I think it gets to this thing where we have to say, okay, all things are permissible, but is everything beneficial? And if there's something inside of you that goes, I shouldn't be doing this, then maybe pay attention to that. Now, there's going to be a shameful voice that maybe isn't helpful, and there's going to be a one that maybe feels a little gentler, who says, I have better things for you. You're going to have to make a judgment call, you and the Holy Spirit, on what you're convicted with in that regard. But thank you, Ashleigh, for responding so thoughtfully, as you always do. All right, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. If you guys want to submit some other ones, feel free to do so. How do you deal with or help Christian friends who are openly sexually active?
That's a good question. I think some of that comes down to my very bad off-the-cuff illustration of the toaster and the hammer. Of just talking to friends of like, is that what you, that's not stretchy, is that what you think I want you to do? But of being able, you have to be at a spot in a friendship where you can have that conversation, and you may or may not be at that spot, because if it's just somebody that you like meet for coffee every once in a while, and you know they're having sex with their boyfriend, but you're not super close, that's probably not a subject that you want to vouch or you want to broach with them, and in that case I would say, let's just pray for them. But if it's somebody that you're close with and they're coming to you with a question, or you are in that kind of a relationship, and you probably have friends like this where maybe you call each other out once in a while, you might say like, hey, what are you thinking here? What are your thoughts behind what you're doing? And maybe listening in that situation to see like what is going on. Because a lot of times, especially with Christians or people that have grown up in church, I feel like there's a couple of things that happen when people kind of go off the rails that way. And one is that either they aren't really clear of the whys of sexuality, and if you can help them walk through that, like why does God tell us to do these certain things, that's helpful. The other thing is that's often a like point of rebellion of like, I already know that I'm not really good with God, so I'm just doing this because I don't care. And in that case, there's probably not going to be anything that you can say that's going to be super helpful. Again, I would go back to my first answer, which is pray for them. There may be certain circumstances where you can talk to somebody, and honestly, it's not going to be like you're probably going to have one conversation and convict them, and they're like, oh my gosh, you're right, I should stop doing that. It would probably, you're probably looking at multiple conversations of let's keep talking about this, and the more you know the why behind what's happening, and if it's just of, I don't understand what the Bible says, or I'm just really mad at God right now, so this is kind of how I'm lashing out, the more you'll be able to kind of answer those questions and help them walk through them. I don't know, do you have any other?
Yeah, I think you've said a lot of really good things.
Said a lot of things, as per usual.
Said a lot of things, all of them great. I think that trust always needs to come first in those kinds of situations. There are some friends that I have where I can talk about anything I want with them, and when I tell them that they're where I think they're off, I can tell them that they're off. Most of my friends are not like that.
Yeah.
And when it comes to something as personal and as impactful as what I'm doing with my sexuality, I need to have earned the right to speak into that space. Even last week, Larry White was like, guys, with grace and truth, lead with grace. Truth will follow. And I think always it's better to err on the side of mercy. Grace, forgiveness, acceptance, those things, the kindness of God is what compels people to repentance. And so if you're leading, with a Bible thump, and you're like, hey, I care about you, so I'm going to call you out on your sins, sometimes that's appropriate. Other times that's actually going to push them farther away. And so that's what I would say. That trust is super important. And you do not know all that is going into that situation. I mean, sexuality can have really deep wounds and associations, and you do not want to tread on that kind of ground unless you know exactly what you're getting into.
Yeah, I would say the same holds true for family too, which I have a hard time with. If it's your brother or sister that's doing something that you're like, we grew up together, you know better than that. You still have to have that place of trust to be able to have those conversations.
Next question. I've been told that I would experience complete freedom from my pornography addiction. However, I still struggle with this from time to time, and I sometimes wonder if I'm actually being redeemed. What do you think freedom from pornography addiction actually looks like?
That's a big one.
If only we were all so honest and vulnerable with the things that we're struggling with. I have thoughts, but do you have thoughts?
You can start.
If you look at pornography addiction the way that you look at any addiction, say alcohol, right? An alcoholic will almost always admit that they'll always be an alcoholic. And it becomes this gradual lifetime endeavor to push back against the power of that addiction. And it's powerful. You know, you get your 30-day pin, and you have a relapse. Your 60-day pin, your 90-day pin, you get 10 years sober, right? And they'll say, you know what, I'm always going to be an alcoholic. And it becomes, can I now be in the same room with somebody who has a glass of wine? Can I now be in the same building where I know alcohol is available, right? Like, our addictions tend to weaken the further we distance ourselves from them, but it's a process, it takes time. And I would say too, rarely ever, if ever, do we experience freedom from addictions without community, without people that can know everything that we're going through, when and how and why. I don't think there's a simple solution. I think for a lot of people it means lots of different things. It means knowing yourself. It means taking the steps. It's complicated, and it can take a really long time. But I would say to whoever sent that in, don't be discouraged. Don't be discouraged. What you're fighting is a very, very difficult thing. Do everything that you know to do, and keep doing it. Keep trusting in God that His grace is sufficient for you. Keep knowing that His forgiveness is good for even you. And you may wrestle with the desire to be addicted to pornography your entire life. You know, we tend to make a really big deal about things like being gay, but we all have sexual desires that are unnatural and unhealthy for us, right? Most of us have polygamous sexual desires where we long for more than one person. Those are things that we have to put up with our entire lives, and we die to the self every day. All right, I'm gonna stop, but that's
No, I would say the one thing, I'm sorry whoever told you that you would have complete freedom, because I honestly don't know that you will, but it won't be this side of heaven, because none of us get complete freedom from sin this side of heaven, and you are not unique. Your particular addiction is not unique in that, and every single person in this room is going to have something that they struggle with every day until they meet Jesus. And that might be lust, it might be a pornography addiction, it might be alcoholism, it might be greed, it might be gossiping, it might be any number of things. But don't let Satan tell you that because yours is one that we kind of are like, oh, that one's bad, that you're any worse than any other person in this room. Because you're not.
That's good. At what age do you think children of a Christian family should be talked to about sex? There's lots of good literature on this.
Yes. I will recommend a book again, because I know many. I worked with a youth pastor in Naperville, Illinois. His name was Adam Burse, and he wrote a book called We Need to Talk that is specifically about parents and talking. I read the book because I just heard it was about sex, and I knew the guy, so I'm like, I should support him and buy his book. I didn't really know what it was about. And then I started reading, and I was like, this book is not for me. I'm not a parent. But it's really helpful in that it is a fictionalized account of a family. Little girl comes home from school and asks, Mommy, what's sex? And then they're like, we were not prepared for this discussion. So they go and interview a bunch of different people to find out their experiences and whatever. And it actually has a plan that you can write up with you and your spouse of like, this is how we're going to talk about this. This is when we're going to, at what age we're going to approach different subjects. And it has helpful tools about how to do that. So, great book.
Yeah, I would say the second a child becomes aware of his or her own body and starts asking questions, that's when we should start talking about it. At appropriate levels,
Yeah.
obviously. Sometimes someone will be like, where do babies come from? And all they want to know is, oh, they come from mommy's tummy. And you're like, well, okay, let's sit down and talk about it. They have age-appropriate questions that they'll ask. And so, yeah, I think as soon as they start having questions. I had a friend that their parents, they were some of the healthiest, most emotionally put together people I'd ever met, especially when it came to relationships. And it was, I think, largely because they had such an open conversation with their parents about everything sexual. Like to the point where the 14-year-old kid came home from 8th grade and was like, hey, my friends are talking about anal sex, what is that? At the dinner table. And they're like, let's talk about it.
Not the best dinner conversation.
No, in terms of aesthetics, maybe not a good choice, but in terms of relationship, I mean, he felt comfortable enough to literally say anything to his parents. And so if your kids can, at some point, not feel ashamed of their bodies, and feel like they can talk to you about literally anything, that's a win.
Yeah, and that was the key, I think, in that book, is you want to make sure that you set yourself as the expert and a safe person to talk to very early on, because otherwise kids are going to go to their friend at school who, again, is not going to give them probably accurate information, and then you are not seen as the expert peers are.
And even think about the way that you respond when you want to ask a question about something. If somebody goes, you all of a sudden feel like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have asked that. Like that was, so if a kid senses that from you and they're like, hey, what's this? And you're like, ugh, they all of a sudden feel a no-no or a shame around something that they don't need to. This question is, do you think that there are sexual acts between married couple that are inherently damaging or immoral by God's standards? Things like BDSM, depriving talk. I have thoughts, but you go for it.
Probably, and the answer is, some of that has to do with if, one, you don't want to make anyone feel uncomfortable. That's not the goal of sex. Again, if we're comparing to Ephesians 5, we're saying, I'm sacrificing myself for you. And if you're saying, I want to do something because I like it and you don't, that's not good. That is not using sex in a way that it's meant to be. It's meant to be a binding, joining, unifying, loving act, not this thing is for my pleasure and I don't care how you feel about it. I think too, when it gets to some things are just seem to be naturally degrading. And so if you feel degraded by something, or if one partner feels degraded by something, or even if you start to realize that it's changing how you're thinking about the person and you're starting to view them in more of an objective way rather than a this is the person who I love. Again, the goal is binding, unifying, loving, not I am using you in order to get my jollies. So it's such a weird expression, I don't know why I said it. But yeah, so probably that would be what that, again, I'm not gonna say like there's a list of things that are clearly bad and a list of things that are okay, because I think it'd be a weird book. Because I think it would have to do with the individual couple. I think as long as nobody feels like they're being objectified or demeaned or and both people are into it, then okay, cool. But yeah, if you start to get into those kinds of things, then it starts to, because it's just a mental thing of like, now this isn't about love or binding or unity. Now this is about, it's just seeking pleasure for pleasure's sake and what I want.
Yeah, I had a pastor in my life who told me that I was going to require more sexual self-control in marriage than out. And I was like, what are you talking about? And it's because we have all these expectations and desires that we expect our partner to fulfill. And sex is not a one-way interaction. It's not a one-way transaction. There are two souls. And I think anytime two people, one of the two people feel as if they have to be someone else, or be treated as something else, or who they are is not enough in the relationship, I think we have to take a step back and say, why is that? Why does it feel like who I am is not sufficient for you? Why does it feel that, or why does it feel like you have to abuse me, even in a fantastical way, in order for us to feel close? Like, what is at the root of that? And again, I'm not trying to make a broad judgment call. I think that question's too big for me to judge. But the second somebody feels like what you described, unsafe, I think you need to take a look at that. What do you do when your partner wants to have sex, but you don't, and you're not married? How do you have that conversation?
Ooh, okay, so I listened to this podcast and they had a great answer, and I just feel like this is not verbatim, but in this scenario that the person talking was describing, it was a female who was being propositioned with male. So he was like, what you should say is go to them and be like, honey, I would love to have sex with you. I would love to jump on you right now. But here's the thing. I would just really first like for you to declare your love for me before all of our friends and family in what is called a wedding. So that's one way. I don't know if I'd actually do that. But I think, again, kind of back to the... Yes, I would love it. But not right now. No, that's kind of the... I think that's, yeah. I might give someone blue balls. I don't know, that's pretty bad. So I think it comes down to asking a similar question to what do you do when you have a friend who's a Christian who is sexually active? Of, okay, let's talk about that. Like, why do you think that is okay? Or why do you want to do that? I think the answer to that is clear. But if the person is also a Christian, then I think that conversation is a legitimate one of, okay, what makes you think that, like, tell me about this. Tell me more, please. What are your thoughts behind this? In as much of a non-judgmental way as you can. If the person that you're with is not a Christian, you're going to have a lot harder time with that because you don't have the same value set going in. They aren't viewing sex probably the same way that you are. And so that conversation is going to be a little more difficult because, yeah, you're just kind of not on the same page in that. Anything that you would add, Ryan?
I think that's great. I mean, I think what you've said is sufficient.
Sorry,
what
that's
look
like
from the front.
What?
Let's come back to this one maybe.
Okay.
I feel like maybe this venue would be strange for that question. Not off limits, but
That's a good question.
what would you recommend doing if you experience a lot of sexual tension in a dating relationship that's trying to remain pure?
cold showers. That might not work.
There's this really cool invention. It's called a chastity belt.
Chastity belt? Yeah, I don't think I would use that either. That's a really good question. Because, I mean, that was me and my husband before we got married. And I don't think we handled that super well, by the way. So I will tell you what I feel like I should have done rather than what I actually did. And that is probably the most important thing, is to have people around you that you can be accountable to. And also to give yourself some grace, to know that if you go farther than what the two of you have agreed that you want to do, that God is not going to smite you down. You're not going to hell for that. There's grace for that. That doesn't ruin the relationship. At the same time, you do need to be able to put in some boundaries, and it can be helpful without getting super legalistic, but to have some rules. If you know that there are certain places, times, occasions on which you are more tempted in that arena, then maybe we say, like I have a friend who's in Ohio, and she just started dating. So they're engaged now. They met on Match.com. But they were kind of struggling with that, and so they started noticing, like, okay, like, we're getting in trouble if I'm at your apartment and no one else is there and we're on the couch. So if we're in your apartment, then we're, like, not going to be in here for longer than a certain amount of time, or we have to have a purpose for why we're in here, or, you know, whatever. And you can do that without being too legalistic, and you can also be like, well, if you were here because you got snowed in or something, like, I'm not going to kick you out. You know, like, you can be flexible with those rules while then still being
Too hot.
Yeah.
Can't be in this
So
cabin.
having accountability,
No!
singing "Baby It's Cold Outside" or something. Having accountability in that is helpful, and occasionally setting some boundaries and rules can be helpful too. But honestly, you know what the real solution is to freaking get married. So just.
Although I wouldn't say
Not if you've only
just
dated
get
for like a
married
month or
because
something.
you're aroused easily. that's
No,
also not
no,
a
no, no.
solution.
No, but if you all are like, you are all of marriageable age at this point, if you've been dating for a decent amount of time, you are agreed that this person is who
Just make
you
it
want
happen.
to be married to, no one in your family hates this person for no reason, you
I'll marry you
probably
right
should just
here.
go ahead and do it.
Just kidding. Okay. So I would say too, that's why having an equal set of values when it comes to sex can be really important, because that determines your boundaries, right? So like if both of you value saving sexual activity for the confines of a marriage relationship, you should both be on the same page with that. That's going to be helpful. And the boundaries that you draw shouldn't be like where you want to stop. Like I don't think that's a good idea. Because, okay, let's say I have like a really fast-powered car, right? And I draw a line on the freeway that's like right here. Like, if I'm like going 70 miles per hour and like things are getting hot and heavy and like we're getting excited and things are getting steamy, blah, blah, blah. And we're like, we can do everything up to like that point, and I'm like gunning it. And then I'm like, okay, hit the brakes. Like, I'm not gonna stop at that line. If I hit the brakes there, I'm gonna go way past it. And there's gonna be skid marks and it's gonna be crazy, so.
And two, if you set a point like that and you hit the brakes, your brain learns from that. So if you're always used to, we go up to this point and then we stop, you may have trouble going past that point if you do get married, just an FYI. So it is better to be more conservative, probably, on the boundaries that you set and give yourself a little grace on those than to be like, oh, well, as long as we don't have sex, we're fine, because you're going to get right up to there.
I would say knowing yourself and knowing your partner is important too. Like, I had a friend once that told me like I get sexually aroused when I hold their hand. And I was like, that must make everything really difficult for you. So like, they had to just always be in public because it was that intense for that person, right? But whereas someone else is gonna be like, I'm okay, you don't need to freak out. I'm holding your hand and it's gonna be fine. You know, like, know the person, know your partner. Why do some people in the church connect past premarital sex, to the reason why a person is now sick or suffering from illness?
Oh.
Because they're messed up.
Yeah, I'm saying because they have bad theology?
Yeah, 100%. I think that I was a that was good. I was a part of a culture that tried to over-spiritualize everything, and it was like, oh, you were having headaches because you said this thing to this person, and that demon is haunting you. You know, like, they're always trying to over-connect everything. And as much as I love to believe that everything's connected and that everything is spiritual, I also believe sometimes, you know, a cake is just a cake, to quote Freud, right? Like, I think sometimes we make too big of a deal of stuff. And again, that doesn't speak to the redemptive power of who Jesus is. Like, if there's something that I've done in my past, like, that thing is redeemable, no matter what it is. Honestly, no matter what it is, even if it's murder, you know, like, even if I know this is weird, but like, even if I am Adolf Hitler, I am redeemable.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow, some way, the love of Jesus is powerful enough for even me. So yeah, I think that whoever is saying like, oh, it's because of your past sexual sins that you're not dealing with A, B, and C, I think that's bad theology. I do think that past trauma can affect us now. So that's not to say that nothing in our past will ever affect our future. There are consequences and there are things that happen to us because of things that happened in the past, but never is it helpful to say like, B is happening because of A, because you just don't know. You're not God.
That totally, again, discounts the concept of grace, of saying because you did, that's saying if I input A, I will always get out B, and God isn't a machine that works like that. And sometimes we do really bad stuff and we still get really good things. And other times we do all the right things and we don't get the thing that we want. And both of those are grace, because grace is giving what you don't deserve. And there's two sides to that coin.
100%. Last question was, do cold showers actually work?
That was why we laughed. It wasn't the first one.
I mean,
probably not.
The idea of a cold shower to me is just like terrifying. Like, I can't do it.
That's like if you wanted to torture me, all it would really take is making me take a cold shower.
So I guess that would work then. Like if you're in a state of arousal and then you just
in the moment, like here, you throw you in the shower, you're feeling hot. Like,
I'm just wondering how often cold showers are available for those who find themselves aroused. Like, I just don't know if that's always a convenient option.
Just like have to have a portable shower with you at all times.
I actually have a good answer for this though. So there's a therapy treatment that is used for people who are addicted to pornography. What happens when you get sexually aroused is you move from your frontal lobe, which is where you do all of your higher thinking, the thing that makes you a human being, some argue, you move to the lizard brain or the ape brain. That's the instincts, that's the bodily desires, that's the hunger, that's the sex, that's the flight or flight mode. All that is the lizard brain. So if you can bring your thoughts back to this brain, it tends to push against the lizard brain. So that's why mindfulness is often an exercise that therapists recommend for anyone who has addictions, is begin to be thoughtful about the things that are happening rather than just blowing through something. So whenever you can engage your higher thinking, that's helpful. My friend told me about this app that when you're feeling tempted to watch pornography, you can tap this button that says, I'm feeling tempted, and it starts giving you all these trivia questions. And then and they're not easy ones, they're really difficult, like math equations and things. And then after a while, it says, are you still feeling tempted? No? Okay, let's do some more trivia. And eventually it brings like the stuff that's happening back here to the front.
You can get really good at math this way too.
It's a win-win situation for sure. So anyway, that's one thing, is think about what you're thinking about. That is part of what it will help you to be a healthy human being, is to exercise your higher thinking. God gave it to you, it's amazing.
It'll probably work better in a cold shower.
I would say
and be more
so.
readily available.
Yeah, and not be as horrible, I would say. That's it for the questions, Ashleigh.
All the questions.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here. Can we
Thanks
say
for
thank you to
having
Ashleigh for taking this time? It's really good. Obviously, we did not exhaust every conversation we can have about sexuality. That's not possible. Know that I'm always available. If you'd like to talk to me about anything, we can meet here at the church in a way that makes you feel comfortable. There are also women that I know that would be also readily available.
I was going to say, you can always, if you have any other weird questions, you can always email me at arich@b4church.org.
Ashleigh is really good at getting back to people.
I'm very good at email.
I'm working on it.
They need some.
But Ashley's really good. I know Jana loves to talk to people too about stuff. So I just volunteered her for like
In a cautious way.
if
Like,
you have any trauma you'd like to discuss,
go
talk
see
my way.
Jana.
Yeah.
Send that to me. I take the fun questions. Jana can have the hard stuff.
Yeah, so we'll continue to talk about this. Again, next week we're going to be talking to a person named Gregory Coles. Gregory Coles wrote a book called Single Gay Christian. He's a person who has only ever felt sexual attraction to people of the same sex, and he loves Jesus, and his early life was a lot about, like, what do I do with that? And I got to talk with him on the phone, and it was funny because, I'm going to tell you a little story. It's part of the announcement. It'll make sense. I was really, really excited to bring someone in called named Brad Harper, who was going to come in and speak. He wrote a book with his son called Space at the Table.
You should all buy it. It's great.
It's fantastic. He is a conservative theological professor. He is an agnostic gay person. And they co-wrote a book together about how they were able to maintain a loving relationship despite their fundamental disagreements. I was really excited for him to come in. I'm sorry that he had a family emergency. He couldn't do it. So I then reached out to Deborah Hirsch, who's like a hero of mine. I fangirled when I met her so hard. Jana knows. She was there. I hugged her. It was totally inappropriate. She's amazing. She wrote a book called Redeeming Sex that actually changed the way that I thought about people. It was incredible. I reached out to her. She was like, I can totally do it. Let's have me speak. And I was like, yes. And then she was like, I'm gonna have to back out. And I was like, no. She's like, but I will recommend a friend to you who is amazing, who will do a better job than me. And I was like, better than you, Deborah? It's not possible. And I know, I'm pathetic. So she recommended you this guy, and I call him on the phone, and I was like, hey, Deborah Hirsch recommended you. I love her, so you must be amazing. Let's talk about it. And he started telling me his story, and I had a flashback, and I was like, wait, are you so-and-so, and were you on so-and-so's podcast? And he was like, yeah. I had just listened to a week before a podcast interviewing this person, I remember thinking while I was listening to the podcast, oh my gosh, I need to buy this guy's book. It's incredible. And I'm talking to him on the phone, and I was connecting these dots, and honestly, this guy is amazing. So he's going to come virtually next week. Because he's in Pennsylvania. So he's going to FaceTime in, but we're going to be in real time. I'm going to be interviewing him, and you're going to submit questions to him. If you have friends who are gay, and they have questions about what it means to be a Christian and be gay, he has lots of things to say about it. We're going to be selling his book here. So come, if you have friends that are gay and you want to know how to love them well, just so you guys know, the church has done a lot of work to say why or why not certain sexuality is acceptable. in the midst of that, we've done a lot of damage to box people out, condemn people, judge people. It's not been pretty. The church has been really guilty, especially to the LGBTQ plus people, of being really horrible and not extending the love and grace of Jesus. That's not what we're aiming to do next week. What we're aiming to do is to say, how do we love people that are going through something that we don't fully understand? That's it. How do we extend the love and grace of Jesus to people who are just as much human beings and just as much as we're sexually broken, they're sexually broken? What does that look like? And so, come next week for that. It's going to be really, really great. Other than that, we're done for tonight. So why don't I pray for us? And if you want to talk to Ashleigh afterwards, don't keep her too late. Or keep her really late.